Greetings. This is Chapter 16, Selected Benefits and Protections for Employees. This is sort of a catch-all category where we're going to cover things like the Fair Labor Standards Act and the laws around overtime and things like that. We're also going to cover things like the Family and Medical Leave Act and OSHA and ERISA and other employee benefit laws and regulations. There's a wide variety of them, and they don't fit into any one of the other categories really easily. So this kind of becomes like anything that didn't fit in one of those other themes. Anyway, it's very detailed, a lot of stuff in it, and we sort of saved the best for last because these are some important things you need to stay on top of. Fair Labor Standards Act, boy, if we violate wages and hours, we don't properly designate someone as exempt or non-exempt, if we don't properly pay wages for overtime and things like that, this can be very costly for a company. So while this is last and this is sort of a lot of things dumped into this chapter, this is an essential chapter for us to understand in terms of day-to-day HR administration. There are 9 learning objectives in this chapter. Number 1, we're going to list the matters regulated by the Fair Labor Standards Act and similar state laws. Fair Labor Standards Act gets at child labor, gets at overtime, and gets at minimum wage regulations. So we'll understand the Fair Labor Standards Act, how it applies across the board. Number 2, discuss the minimums requirements of the minimum wage laws and to whom they apply. Again, with respect to minimum wage, who gets paid minimum wage, who gets paid below minimum wage, and where does minimum wage come into play? And we know this is a controversial topic, right? A lot of economists for a long time have thought that a minimum wage was bad for the economy. And in fact, what we realize when we set a minimum wage that's too low, employers are not willing to trickle down. Trickle down economics doesn't work. It's proven to not work, yet people still believe that it does for some reason. It doesn't work that way. Employers don't pass on their profits to their employees in the form of really good wages. So that as it may, the minimum wage laws and what we minimally should pay people, it's in flux right now because there's a lot of states that are increasing their minimum wage regulations. In some states it's 15, some states it's 12, some states it's still $7. So we'll see how the economy sort of plays out in those different scenarios. Number 3, explain the Family and Medical Leave Act, including to whom it applies and under what circumstances. And obviously there's a minimum requirement of the number of employees that are required to use the Family and Medical Leave Act, where they're obligated to do it. And so we should be aware of what we need to have minimally to be able to use the Family and Medical Leave Act, are required to use it, in other words, and how it can be administered for people who need to take leave for any variety of reasons. Explain how workplace injuries and illnesses are handled via workers' comp, which has replaced the prior fault-based approach. Workers' comp came about because, again, we wanted a no-fault way to deal with workplace safety issues, to make sure that we didn't blame people for liability, and therefore employees were getting hurt on the job and not having their injuries cared for by the organization, and they would lose their jobs. So the whole idea of workers' comp is it's no fault. We don't care whose fault it is, whether it was the employee or the employer. The bottom line is, if they were hurt while doing the work of the company, that they are protected under workplace compensation insurance. Number 5, understand how OSHA's preventative emphasis has impacted the regulatory environment. So OSHA came about, and not in large part because of union influence, right? The Occupational Safety and Health Act, the goal was to have safer workplaces, and unions fought for this very hard. So how does it affect the way that we go about setting up our policies and procedures, What do we need to do to make sure that we keep our workers safe, not just from workplace injuries like I lost my arm because it got stuck in a machine kind of thing, but really, how do we deal with stress? How do we deal with repetitive motion injuries? How do we deal with eyesight fatigue because people spend all of our time on computers? So how do we keep our workplace safe for our employees as best as we can? Objective 6, set forth what OSHA requires of employers to create a safer workplace and how it is enforced. Bottom line is OSHA requires us to keep our workers safe. Even if there's not a established standard for it, we have to make a good faith effort to keep our employees safe in the workplace. So there we have obligations to do that. Number 7, describe the reporting responsibilities of employers under the OSHA Act. So what do you have to report? When do you have to report it? What does that reporting system look like? Let's see, that's 5, 6, 7, 8. Explain the purposes of ERISA and identify who and what type of entities are covered. ERISA is regarding pension plans, and it protects the employees from abuses in pension plan management, and it has a lot of requirements attached to it. Describe the minimum ERISA standards for employee benefit plans. And again, we have to have a minimum expectation for how we handle retirement funds and what we need to do minimally, right? And so we'll get into some detail on that. The statutory basis for the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, is about, again, making sure that we understand what is overtime and not overtime, what is minimum wage, etc. And I'll read what this legislation is entitled. Every employer shall pay to each of its employees who in any work week is engaged in commerce or in the production of goods for commerce, or is employed in an enterprise engaged in commerce or in the production of goods for commerce, wages at the following rates: not less than $6.55 an hour beginning July 24th, 2008, and $7.25 per hour effective July 24th, 2009. So this is talking about the minimum wage that is expected to pay at the federal level. It's $7.25 an hour. Now I'm going to pull up my calculator here. Let's say $7.25 times 40 hours a week times 52 weeks a year. So if you work 40 hours a week at $7.25 an hour, no vacation time, 52 weeks you work, that's a total of $15,000, $15,080 to be precise. That is the minimum that we're supposed to pay employees. I don't know about you, but I know I couldn't live on $15,000 in 2021. I could barely live on $15,000 a year as a starting salary in 1985, let alone 2021. So this is a concern. And that's why a lot of states are increasing their minimum wage numbers to something a little bit more reasonable at around 15 or 20, 12 or $15 an hour. The second part of that statute, no employer shall employ any of his employees for a work week longer than 40 hours unless such employee receives compensation for his employment in excess of the hours above, specified at a rate not less than 1.5 times the regular rate at which he is employed. So this is setting the standard for the work week, which is 40 hours a week. And we can thank unions for that, because it used to be people would work 6 or 7 days a week with no limits to the number of hours that they could be asked to work, and largely for very little money. So the Fair Labor Standards Act sets the overtime rate at 1.5 times the regular rate. And this includes not just work where I'm on site, but it could be if I'm obligated to go to a training, you have to pay me for that time. And all those excess things, anything that the company requires me to do, they have to pay me for it if I am non-exempt, meaning that they have to pay me overtime. So how did the FLSA come about? Well, again, as we talked a little bit about in the section on labor unions, right, the impact of New Deal on a lot of labor law, it also had a lot of impact on general employment issues, right? Because the goal of the New Deal was to get people back to work in a way that could keep them stable with money in their pocket. We were coming out of the Great Depression and really struggling with how to keep people afloat. And so the New Deal was enacted in order to be able to do that. So this is a New Deal law, happened in 1938, and this was almost 10 years after the beginning of the Depression. And this was done to regulate pay and hours worked and child labor, which was a very, very big issue during this time frame, where children were working alongside their parents in sweatshops doing hard labor. And because the more family members that work, the more money you would have in your pocket for very low paying jobs. So what the FLSA does, it sets the minimum age for workers in particular jobs. For example, um, children cannot work with heavy machinery, and there's only a certain number of hours they're allowed to work if they are in school. And when they're outside of school and under 18, there are certain constraints, but once they're over 18, there's different constraints. Minimum wages. It's the least amount a covered employee must be paid in hourly wages. And again, we already did the math, right? It's $15,080. If you paid somebody $7.25 an hour times 52 weeks times 40 hours per week, that's not a lot of money. Because if you think about the cost for rent, rent is about $1,000 a month in some places. Obviously, we could share, right? We could split the cost with someone. So let's pay $500. That's still, you know, 500 is about $6,000 a year. That leaves you with taxes taken out of the top of that $15,000 and then $6,000 for rent. Very little left to buy a car, to pay for daycare, to do all the things that a working parent might need to have. So minimum wage jobs don't pay a lot. Overtime. It defines a regular 40-hour work week, and anything over that is considered overtime and must be paid at time and a half. And this is all is administered by the Labor Department of Labor, the Labor Department Wage and Hour Division. If you have a wage and hour audit, be careful, because once they find one problem, they will dig like bloodhounds to find all sorts of violations, and then you will be held liable for all of those violations. So making sure that you have employees properly designated and that you are paying them appropriately for all their time committed to the job is essential. Um, it is a fertile source of class action suits, because even small defects in compliance multiplied by a large number of workers and hours worked can lead to expensive verdicts or settlements. So this is, if somebody complains that they are not making the proper amount of money, if they're having issues with overtime, they turn around and they complain, wages and hours will come investigate, but they're not just going to investigate you, they're going to investigate every employee at that organization to see if there's a systemic problem, and they're entitled to do that under the law. So this is a very sensitive area, and an area where you better get the numbers correct. You don't mess with people's pay. So, of course, whether or not an employee is an independent contractor or an employee actually goes back to what some of the things we talked about at the very beginning of the course, and the idea of the economic realities. Does the employee depend on the business, or is the employee relatively independent and able to make the work, do that work on their own? And so for whom do they essentially work is really what it comes down to. If we misclassify people, this is a problem for wages and hours, and so we want to be careful about that. 15 states bolster the misclassification initiative to make sure that it is properly enforced, so that we're not misclassifying employees inappropriately. Couple of interesting applications. One was regarding NFL cheerleaders, regarding whether or not they were employees or independent contractors. And there was a lot of mix up even amongst the cheerleaders themselves as to whether some of them wanted to be considered employees, or some of them just said, we do this with the expectation that's going to give us a job later on. Just because that's what we've always done doesn't mean that it's still the right thing to do. If they should be paid a certain minimum, they should be paid overtime appropriately. And given that the NFL cheerleaders were being completely controlled by their franchise, they had very little free time. They were expected to behave in a particular way on the job and off the job. They don't really fall into the category of independent contractors. They do fall into the category of a controlled employee that is being controlled because of the image that they want the cheerleaders to project, and therefore that definitely is related to employment, being an employee and not an independent contractor, as we talked about several weeks ago. Other things regarding the Fair Labor Standards Act has to do with whether or not we pay for breaks, whether or not we pay for the donning and the doffing of PPE and other types of protective equipment that we need to do for our job, uniforms, those sorts of things. Do you pay women for lactation time because we are obligated to give them lactation time, but how do we deal with that? And then, and other issues. In terms of Barack Obama, he tried very hard to increase the minimum wage. Um, Congress refused to raise the minimum wage to above $7.25 an hour. And so he at least set up an executive order saying if you're a federal contractor, your minimum wage is $10.10 an hour. Still not a ton of money, but at least it's a lot better than $7.25 an hour. He did try to change some of the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act for what is considered to be exempt and what is the threshold for exempt, but that was supposed to go into effect after the election of Donald Trump, and that was pulled back and it never went into effect. So the minimum standards on that are still the same as they were 20 odd years ago. Internships, there's a whole issue, Exhibit 16.1, regarding the test for whether or not an internship is actually paid or unpaid and whether or not they're eligible for money. So you want to look for that test for unpaid interns, which is on page 906 in your textbook. Internship, even though it included actual operation of the facilities of the employee, is similar to training which would be given in an educational environment. The internship experience is for the benefit of the intern. The intern does not displace regular employees, but works under supervision of them. The employer then provides the training that derives no immediate advantage from the activities of the intern, and on occasion, its operations that may actually be impeded. The intern is not necessarily entitled to a job at the conclusion of the internship, and the employer and the intern understand that the intern is not entitled to wages for the time spent in the internship. So you have to be very clear on the boundary conditions of what is an internship, paid or unpaid, and why. Because otherwise, if it's not clear, they're going to be considered an employee and eligible for pay and overtime and all those details.